welcome to today's presentation. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm the Chief Content Officer here at RealClearPolitics. Today, we're just 3 days shy of Joe Biden's first 100 days in office. The 100th day is actually Friday, April 30th, for those of you who are keeping score. And the way we're going to do this today, we're going to have some opening comments by some of my colleagues, followed by a short discussion, and then we're going to answer as many of your questions as we can. So joining us today are Tom Bevan, President and co-founder of RealClearPolitics, Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, and John Della Volpe, who is Director of Polling at RealClearOpinion Research. So Carl, let's start with you. If you would just give us an overview of what we learned in this most recent poll, as well as some background on RealClearOpinion Research.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief for RealClearPolitics and Executive Editor of RealClear Media Group. 21 years ago, Tom Bevan, who you'll hear from shortly, co-founded RealClearPolitics with John McIntyre. It was a one-stop shopping, which it still is, for people who care about politics and American civic life. The idea was to aggregate, which we do, stories from across the spectrum on our front page. Most of you know this. The other special sauce was the polling average. A lot of people do this now, but they were the first, and you get a much better result if you're trying to do election predictions from looking at averages of polls instead of one poll. There's always outlier polls. But a couple of years ago, we thought we wanted to do more than that. We want to do our own polling, and we wanted to find out why Americans are voting the way they are and what they're thinking about the issues in more depth. We thought this would inform our own writing. I'm in charge of our original content, and also help us understand where the public is and serve our partners better. Some of you are on this. Some of you partners are on this call, so you know. And we need to find a pollster. Once we decided to go into polling ourselves, we thought, well, who's the best pollster? And that reminds me of that great line in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where Butch says, who's the best lawman? And Sundance says, or Butch says, how best, toughest or easiest to bribe? Well, I've never had occasion to have to bribe John Della Volpe, but he's the best pollster I know, the most honest, the most insightful, the best to work with. And it was an obvious thing for us. And we called John and we partnered with him. And he's done these polls now. We're on our 5th or 6th poll. Everything we started with the tribes that comprise the American electorate to woke capitalism. And this latest poll on the Biden record in the first 100 days. And to show you why we think, how you can, if you're doing a polling, you're not just doing horse racing polling, and you're not doing it for a candidate, so you don't really care how it comes out, and you really just want to understand the electorate. Here's a question that John came up with in his polling unit that's based up in Boston. So this was about the stimulus that the $1.9 trillion stimulus that President Biden unveiled, and it polls well. But we wanted to really find out, so why does it poll well? And we had 2 questions that we put to the respondents in the poll. And they were explanations of the package. One is kind of the Republican critique of it, and the other is the Democratic defense of it. The Republican one was this, and this is the wording in our survey. Some say that spending $2 trillion on a massive bill that only directs 1% towards vaccines, ignores the science on reopening schools, and is stuffed with non-COVID related spending is irresponsible. The economy is already improving, and even top liberal economists say it is wrong for this recovery. That was one question. That was one statement we read to them. The other was this. Others say that the need to act is clear. Absent additional government assistance, the economic and health crisis could worsen in the months ahead. Schools will not be able to safely open, and vaccinations will slow. By the end of this year, this law alone would create 7 million new jobs. So we asked people, which of those more conforms to your view? The Republican critique got about 45%. The second, the Democratic explanation of its agenda got 55%. So that's one of the ways in which we can really delve, which John and our polling unit really delves into attitudes. And it made us, and I wrote a piece about it, you can find it on our site. It made us think that Joe Biden was reading the public mood correctly when he made this one of his key priorities, his first great legislative priority as president. And I think with that, because I could go on all day, but I think I'll turn it over to John at that point. Ladies and gentlemen, this is John Della Volpe, who actually did this poll and heads Real Clear Opinion research.
Thanks, Carl, and thanks everyone for spending part of your afternoon with us. I want to now just kind of walk through just 2 or 3 of the highlights of the first 100-day poll. And I want to dive into a couple of slides in a moment, which we'll tee up, and then we'll have Tom Bevan's perspective on kind of what it all means today. This poll that we're going to brief is actually technically not a 100-day poll. We took the poll about a month ago or so. So it's a preview of those 100 days. And to give you some sense, I think that the other public polling in the last week or so is kind of is similar in nature in terms of we have a majority of American voters believing that have a favorable opinion of President Biden or think he's doing an excellent or good job. He's outpacing Congress at this point. We have a plurality believe that the president has met expectations, whatever they are, to each individual. 20% saying he exceeded, 28% saying he failed to meet those expectations. But more importantly, I want to kind of pull back and not talk about what's happening, but I think why it's happening. So Andy and John, if we could show just a couple of these slides first, perhaps slide 1. Okay, so what we have here on this slide, and by the way, this slide is available as part of Carl Cannon's terrific analysis of our poll on the Real Clear Opinion research page within RealClearPolitics. But essentially we have a dozen or so of President Biden and his administration's priorities for the first 100 days. What we did was we did 2 things. We first asked American voters how important each priority was for them. And then we asked how satisfied are they with the progress to date. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through a couple of high points here. Not surprisingly, 80% indicate that getting the pandemic under control is a priority. To give you some sense of the way in which I look at these numbers on a 5-point scale, anything that hits a 40% or above in what I would call a top 2 box is worth taking note of. It's a priority. So almost everything, with the exception of the Keystone Pipeline, would be considered something that kind of jumps off the page in a typical kind of fashion. Okay, so we see that the big 3 or 4 things are getting the pandemic under control, delivering the vaccines, 100 million into arms. He's obviously exceeded that, in dealing with the U.S.-Mexico border crisis. So those are the top 3. President Biden gets pretty good grades. He gets very good grades, I would argue, for the first 2. Getting the pandemic under control and delivering the vaccines. Obviously, those 2 things are connected. He gets a far worse grade on dealing with the U.S.-Mexico border crisis. So that's just kind of worth noting there. You can see that the good news right now on the 2 things that matter most, there's a smallest gap. On the 3rd thing, there's a wider gap. That's worth paying attention to. When we go to the next slide, we can take a look at some of the partisan divides and what is really kind of driving this. Is it Democrats versus Republicans, and where are independents? So if we could go to slide 2, please, we will see. We'll see. This is the satisfaction by party. Okay, a couple things of note here. I think, as Carl talked about on the COVID relief package, 83% of Democrats say that they are satisfied with President Biden's handling of that, and 39% of Republicans. That is as strong of a number as we can see of any question here other than the vaccines. So the COVID relief package, the language and the messaging is critically important, as Carl indicated. And the reason that I think that President Biden is getting such relatively strong marks for like very modern times of polling is because of this independent number here. We see 61% are approving of independents or approving of his handling of COVID relief and the COVID relief package, as well as the vaccine. Again, a lot of questions, I think, surrounding the border, a lot of questions surrounding reopening schools and other things outside of Democrats, and the degree to which he can achieve his goal of being a president that works, that is respected by all members of the electorate, not just his own party. It'll be worth watching this in terms of do his numbers move and increase over time, specifically, I think, on issues like education, finding bipartisan solutions, and other issues on this list. So this is just one small example of the kind of work we do. As Carl mentioned, over the last couple of years, we've done a lot in terms of segmentation of the electorate. We've gone a deep dive in terms of big technology and healthcare, on woke capitalism. So there's a tremendous amount of data that is available, all of which is available with crosstabs on the RealClearOpinion research website. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom. Tom, it's been a few weeks since this has been out of the field, so I'll kind of toss it to you to get your perspective on where we are.
Great. Well, thanks, John. And our polling was basically a preview of what we've come to see. We just saw on Sunday all of the major outlets released their 100-day polling. It was ABC News, Washington Post, NBC, Wall Street Journal, CBS News, Fox News, and effectively confirmed what our polling previewed, which is that Biden's approval rating is in the 52, 53% range overall. His handling of COVID is 10 points stronger than that, 60, 62, 64%. His handling of the economy is at about 52. So a majority of folks approve of the job that he's doing in terms of handling those two major issues. And as John mentioned, and we've seen this replicated in other polling, he's getting very, very low marks on his handling of the border. Guns is another issue where I think he's not doing as well. And so the real question is, well, where does this go? Biden's scheduled to give an address to Congress tomorrow, and he's obviously going to talk up his accomplishments. What's interesting about this is you look at those numbers and you see the Republican support for the initial COVID package, for example, Republican support for this latest infrastructure bill that the Biden administration is trying to move forward with. It is surprisingly strong. For as divided as an electorate, you have about 8 to 12% of Republicans approving of the job that Biden's doing overall, but he's getting 25 to 35% of support of Republicans on his handling of COVID, for example. And part of that includes the COVID relief package that passed. And it passed, by the way, with 0 Republican votes. And so this is one of the things that the Biden administration is really looking at. And you've seen the White House try to frame it this way, that bipartisanship is no longer getting Republican votes in Congress. It is proposing policies that have support of the Republican electorate around the country. So it puts Republican office holders in sort of a unique position, at least in this initial stage, right, where they're not voting for something that, their constituents, at least a certain chunk of them, are approving of. And so what's going to be interesting to see moving forward and watching this whole thing go forward is that as the vaccines get in arms and the country reaches herd immunity and COVID recedes as sort of a threat to the country, as the economy rebounds, the question is, where does Biden go legislatively? What is he able to do? And how does the public view that? There's a couple other data points, which we've seen recently. There was a Quinnipiac poll that came out about 7 and 10 days ago, which saw the question of whether Joe Biden is uniting the country as he vowed to do, has dropped about 15 points just in the last 6 weeks. He was initially over 50% in that metric. He's down now to in the mid 40s. Meanwhile, those who say he's not uniting the country have jumped up almost 10 points. So keep an eye on that number. And also the question of whether people think Joe Biden is governing. Is he too liberal? Is he too conservative? Or is he just right? The question about whether he ends up being too liberal is one to keep an eye on, because again, as we move further away from the crisis of COVID and the economy, those things are going to sort of recede as top issues in the minds of the public. And as we get closer, obviously, to the 2022 midterms, which has a lot at stake, the public view of Joe Biden and the Democratic Party and where they are vis-a-vis the mainstream of the electorate is going to be something that's going to be really critical. So that's kind of the 30,000-foot view of where things currently stand as we sit here at 100 days, the first 100 days of the Biden administration. And we're happy to take some questions and talk more about it. Andy Walworth is going to take over.
So yes, we have so many people on the line that we're taking questions in text form. So if you could text those in, that would be great. And John Sorensen, who is also on the line and producing this program, will be feeding those questions in. So John, as soon as you have a couple of them, let me know. But I'd like to sort of just follow up first on something that Tom said, and that's Congress. And I'm wondering at this 100-day mark, I know we polled on it, but what do other polls tell us about people's attitudes at this point towards Congress, both Democrats and Republicans? Because as John says, the next election is always in our sights. So we've got 2 years here to where there'll be a lot at stake for both parties. So Tom, maybe you take that first.
Sure. I mean, look, Democrats are approval in Congress is higher than Republicans. That's something that's been pretty consistent over time, but they've actually gotten a fairly decent bounce as of recently. The other thing that's really interesting is, and by the way, there's always this attitude, which we see, it's always out there over time, which is, the public hates Congress. When you ask them, what do you think of the Congress in Washington? They get low ratings. And what do you think of your congressman? Oh, I like him or her very much. They're doing a great job, right? So there's this discrepancy between how people view their local elected officials, right, and how they view Washington, D.C. as being responsive to their needs. But even despite that, I think Congress has got higher ratings than it has had in the past. And I think also, interestingly, if you look at the right track, wrong track numbers, which have traditionally been, the public's been in a pretty sour mood for a long time. Basically, 2/3 think the country's moving in the wrong direction. About 1/3 think it's going in the right direction. And obviously, these are, as with everything these days, those numbers are viewed through a heavily partisan lens. But after Biden's election, we've seen that number close in a way that we hadn't in a while. And that makes sense because it seems like we're turning the corner on the pandemic and people are feeling better, more optimistic about the direction that we're heading in after what has been, without question, a very trying year for a lot of folks on a lot of different levels. And so that sort of bodes well if those numbers hold moving forward. Obviously, the Biden administration will reap the rewards. But right now, Congress is in a better position now than they've been in some time, though it's still not. They're not getting majority of approval of what's going on in Washington, D.C.
Good. Well, we've got some questions, and we're going to go to them just in a second. But John Della Volpe, I did want to ask you because you really have studied sort of the Gen X vote probably more than anybody else in the country, and the youth vote. And I'm wondering what you've learned about the youth vote at this 100-day point.
A couple of things, I think, Andy. It's been when I look at the youth vote, Gen Z and millennials, folks basically under 30. I've been studying it for now 21 years, and it's almost like there's like a 180 situation happening over the course of the last year. Okay, both politically in terms of and as well as in terms of the attitudes around the country. Politically, first, a year ago during the Democratic primary, when we looked at all young voters under 30, Joe Biden had a favorability number of 34%, right? Everything was around Bernie Sanders. If it wasn't Bernie Sanders, young people really didn't have too much time for you. Today, that number is increased by 20 points, and it's a 54%. His approval rating is in the high 50s, if not 60s. He is among the most popular presidents at this point of his term that I've measured in my youth-oriented polling on college campuses. So a very significant turnaround there. And we often think about this country being divided, which it is, Democrats, Republicans. It's also divided based upon generations, right? People under 45 or so, millennials and those younger Gen Z feel one way, baby boomers, Gen Xers, silent generation feel another way. And this has been a man-made issue. 20 years ago, there was really no difference in the way an older and a younger person voted. In fact, there's only, I think, a 3 or 4 point difference in that 2000 exit poll. So that's one thing, the generation gap. The other thing, though, is there's much more hope for the future of America in the eyes of young people of color over the last year. We saw essentially a 50-point increase, mostly just based upon, I think, the change of administration, but also I think a lot of young people of color, worked hard, on the campaign, and they see some of their efforts being paid off by the priorities set by President Biden. So overall, the mood is quite good if you're a younger person in America today.
That's interesting. So John Sorensen has been wrangling questions for us here, so I'm going to invite John in to bring us some of your questions, and please keep adding them to the list there. So
so it looks like our first question says it looks like, this is from Stephen Maines, it looks like almost all the metrics are under 35%. Does that mean that Biden is not getting great support from Dems? And how does this compare to past presidents for the first 100 days?
So John, maybe you want to throw up that slide 2. We can take a look at those questions, and then Carl or Tom, perhaps you've got some perspective of other presidents. So these numbers, most of these numbers are a majority of support among Democrats on a 5-point scale, where 3 is kind of a neutral, don't have enough information. So the degree to which, President Biden in this poll or other polls is polling over 50%. Most of that's coming from Democrats, right? Most of that's coming from Democrats. So it's not a question, I think, of Democratic support. It's really a question of support among some of those soft independents and Republicans on issues outside of vaccines, in my opinion.
Can I add something to that, John?
Of course.
If historically presidents got honeymoons, we are so divided now that presidents don't get what we used to think. You don't see presidents with ratings in the 65% in the first month, first 100 days. You're not going to see that for a while unless something changes in this country. But what Joe Biden's looking at and what they're looking at in the White House is that he's out polling Donald Trump at this point in his presidency. And that's, it's not, these aren't great numbers for a president in his first 3 months of office, but they may be about the best you can do right now. And, the Democrats have this, we're talking about Congress, this very narrow lead in the House, less than it was before. They're tied in the Senate. And history suggests that in the midterm elections, the president's party will lose seats. Some people think this is why Biden and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are pushing so hard for their agenda, because they know they've only got 2 years to do it, and less than that, because it's hard to do things in election year. But that's one of those statistics. It's good till it's not good anymore. We never had a reality television star run for president before and win. We never had a president 78 years old elected to his first term. So these numbers that you have now, where the Democrats are more popular than the Republicans in Congress, that's something that's not a trivial thing. And that may be more important right now than these historical numbers that we've looked at in the past.
Tom, Bevan, you want to add?
I'll just add to that. We saw what we saw in 2018 is a perfect example, which we term a historical anomaly, but maybe it's the future. We had all these races now, House races, Senate races are nationalized. And we saw Democrats pick up House seats, but we saw Republicans win Senate seats, particularly in states that had more Republican voters that sort of flexed their muscles, places like Missouri, North Dakota. That's where, so we had this blue wave, if you will, on the House, and we had a red wave in the Senate. We may see something like that again. And certainly to the extent that Joe Biden is able to keep his numbers strong, that benefits the Democratic Party. But obviously, again, go back to what I was saying earlier. If Republicans will say they've got plenty of opportunity to paint Joe Biden as sort of the, that he's getting steamrolled by the left, being, Nancy Pelosi, she'll be in ads. Chuck Schumer will be in ads. AOC will be featured in all these ads running in congressional districts and Senate races around the country, saying, look, this is where the Democratic Party has dragged the country to the left, and you need to vote for me, a Republican, to balance things out. We had said before that it might have been sort of a curse that Joe Biden ended up winning, or that the Democrats ended up winning those 2 Senate seats in Georgia. It obviously gave them a majority with Kamala Harris, but it doesn't give the Democrats anything to run against. They control all the levers of power, and obviously that's something that Republicans will use against them in 2022.
Great. So, John, you got another question for us?
Yeah, I had a good question from Andrew Varsagni. Apologies if the pronunciation is wrong. This one's for John Della Volpe. You mentioned generational splits. Can you please share any insights you've collected as to the generational split on some of the more contentious issues you touched on: border crisis, gun control, health insurance, systemic racism? And then he had a second question about where do you think the independents' dissatisfaction with Biden's policies are coming from generationally?
It's a great question. So I think it's important is where there are splits and where there aren't splits. Okay, so a couple of things, and again, all of these crosstabs, you can find them on our website, RealClearOpinion Research. It's one of the tabs on the right in top of the middle of the page on the Real Clear page. You can link to these crosstabs yourself. So we have everything broken down by age group as well as by generation. I'll give you 2 or 3 quick examples. On the issue, for example, of the importance of rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, okay, 41% of Gen Z and millennials say that's important. 40% of baby boomers and silent generation say that's important. No generational split there, as just one example, okay? Another example on the tax code, okay? Changing the tax code and raising corporate taxes to 28%. We have 42% of younger voters, 44% of older voters say that's important. So again, not a generational split. However, when we look at addressing systemic racism, the importance of that issue, we find a pretty significant split. We see that 63% of younger Americans and 52% of baby boomers and silent generation. So a majority of everybody, but still 12-point advantage in terms of like the intensity and the importance of this issue in the minds of younger people. So what we typically find is that race in particular, as well, to some extent, as Tom mentioned earlier, around guns, perspective around guns, are where we see among the most dramatic generational shifts. The other thing I'd note, which is worth, I think, looking at relative to the president's speech tomorrow, is his overall view of government. This generation of younger people didn't grow up like I did in the 80s, where Ronald Reagan reminded us that government was a problem and not a solution. Okay? This generation today, although they may not trust government, they believe in a fairly robust and strong government. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays relative to the Biden speech in terms of the way in which he positions government as a solution over the next several years of his administration.
Carl, I wonder if you want to just react to that, if you've got any views on that, because I know you wrote about that in your article.
Well, yes, Joe Biden, of course, was born. When was he born? He was born when Roosevelt was president.
Yep.
So he has a perspective very few of us have, and he has invoked Roosevelt. Now he spoke. He was in the Senate. He was Senate Judiciary Committee chairman when Ronald Reagan was president. He gave Ronald Reagan's second inaugural address a very high review. Biden did. He said it was a terrific speech, but he's going back to an earlier template. He looks to Democratic presidents, of course, not just the one he served under, but not just his birth president, but Lyndon Johnson. And this idea, Ronald Reagan said, as John just pointed out in his first inaugural address, at the present moment in this crisis, government's not the solution, government's the problem. Now, Joe Biden has governed as though, we're in a different time. And he's made it very clear that in this present crisis, he thinks government is the solution. He's got a majority of Americans agree with him. And this idea that we're talking about the 100 days in Biden's presidency, it was during Roosevelt's time that really got started. And Roosevelt hit the ground running. He had legislation. Now the inauguration was in March then, not January, changed because of that transition, changed 4 years later. But he hit the ground running, and he thinks that the first 100 days sets the template for what he's trying to accomplish. And what he's trying to accomplish is to convince a majority of Americans that government can first of all address COVID, then pick up, help this economy and get America back to where it was before this COVID leveled us. The next step, though, is the harder one, and Tom alluded to this. Criminal justice reform. There are some partisan differences there. There's some generational differences there. There's some uncertainty. When you have a movement called defund the police, you have to explain what your slogan is. You probably needed a new slogan, and they're not using that anymore. But it's going to get tougher from Joe Biden, just as it did for Roosevelt after the first flurry of legislation goes through.
Great. So, John, you got another question for us?
Yes. So Catherine Salgado was asking, Biden seems to be getting a lower rating on the COVID relief package versus overall handling. Do you see a kind of a trending difference between people's response on a general impression versus once they get into specific issues?
Tom, you want to take that?
Well, I mean, John, do you have specifics on that? I can speak to the
overall big picture, Tom, and I'll pull up some specifics.
Yeah, sure. Look, I do think Biden's handling of COVID writ large has a lot to do with the vaccinations, right? And the progress that we've made on that. On the specific piece of legislation, as I mentioned, 0 Republican votes, even though it has some Republican support. But anytime you do legislation, and you ask people about how it's going to be paid for, you get into sort of the details of it, you're going to find that there will be some resistance there, particularly if you're looking at that through a partisan lens. And again, I mean, if you talk about the first 100 days, he was able to pass this legislation, did it with no Republican votes, using reconciliation. So it was a bit of a heavy lift, and that was the easy part. Now they're looking at another $2 trillion here for infrastructure, which is going to be even harder, not only because there will be no Republican votes to support it, but you also have now Democrats like Joe Manchin, who are basically sort of hitting the brakes and saying, look, I don't want to do this on a party line vote. Again, you look at HR 1, the election reform package that's coming out of the House. Carl mentioned criminal justice reform. We talk about, there's another Biden package that's in the works that's supposed to be in the $2 trillion range to come out in a few weeks. So these things are stacking up and they're going to be tougher and tougher to pass. But certainly when you look at the first bill, it had some Republican support, but certainly, Biden's approval overall on COVID is in addition to that, it's also about the progress that we've made on vaccination. I think people feel like we're turning the corner and we're getting to a place where COVID is finally, under control.
John, Della Volpe.
Thanks. What I'm enjoying about this conversation, what I enjoy about kind of my collaboration, time I spend with Carl and Tom and Andy as others, is trying to bring different kind of perspectives and the nuance to what we try to do as pollsters, right? It's not just about predicting who's going to win or who's going to lose something, 18 months from now within a couple of points. Carl mentioned earlier about the importance of language. So in this survey, we actually asked a split sample question. Okay. One is the overarching question, which is, do you support or oppose Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief plan? Okay. Most polls, that's what we ask. We assume as pollsters, many pollsters assume, but we shouldn't, that everyone knows enough to have a strong opinion about that. Regardless, 2/3 of Americans, or 68%, support that generic package. Okay, 27% oppose it, 5% say they don't know. However, when we essentially kind of lift the language that is used to describe the bill, do you support or oppose Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief plan and include details, including that provides $1,400 checks for individuals earning up to X, Y, Z, provides a child tax credit of $3,000, extends unemployment insurance, offers rental and homeowner assistance, provides money to reopen schools, get people back to work, expands earned income tax credit, reduces health insurance. When we give those specifics, Americans are 6 points more likely to support it. It goes from 2/3 to 3/4, including a majority of Republicans. So again, it really matters in terms of how we ask a question, how a position is messaged in order to really kind of elicit response. But I would say I was actually somewhat surprised that a majority of Republicans supported that $2 trillion plan with Biden's name when they know the details of where the money is going. Because of course, Republicans like Democrats have kids who want to go to school, have small businesses that need, kind of support from the broader economy opening up, et cetera, et cetera. So,
John, can I add one thing to that? Just one thing. So, Andy, as John and I were looking at these numbers, you think $2 trillion, all of it borrowed money, every cent. And as Tom Bevan mentioned, $2 or $3 or $5 trillion packages in the future. I expected fiscal conservatives, Republicans, most of them are, to say, well, wait a minute, hold it. Is this maybe I'm nervous about the borrowing? That just didn't show up in the poll. It hasn't yet. Maybe it won't. Maybe we're all Bernie Sanders types now. Maybe we just think the government prints money and you never have to pay it back. My guess is that at some point this will start to hit the American people, what we've done here. And I don't know when, and I don't even know for sure it's going to happen. But so far it hasn't happened. And so that point that John just stressed, that can't be emphasized enough. The more people know about this stimulus, the more they like it. And that was a surprise to me too.
Well, we have time for one more question, and I'm actually going to take the moderator's prerogative. Some of these questions came in early by email, so we had a set of those. And the one that I just wanted to touch on, and Tom, maybe we'll start with you, which is just this question of immigration. It seems like in all these polls, immigration is a sore point for the president. Obviously, why do you think that is? And is that something that he's vulnerable on at this point?
Because it's in the news, obviously, it becomes top of mind. It is always an issue that animates Republicans, not so much Democrats. It's tough to parse out on the Democratic side how many folks disapprove of the way he's handling it because they think he's not doing enough. He's not acting fast enough to let folks in. So it's tough to know exactly, or whether there are, Democrats who are maybe more moderate and conservative who are saying, look, they don't like what's going on at the border. They want to see more border security. But clearly, it's a top of mind issue. It doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. Now, that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be, a detriment to Biden, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. But it certainly right now continues to be sort of a struggle because it continues to be in the news. There doesn't seem to be any short-term solution to it. The Biden administration keeps saying, look, we have to rebuild the whole system, and that's why it's taking so long. So it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon, and it'll continue to be a drag on him as long as it's in the news and people are disapproving the way he's handling it.
John, Della Volpe, you want to add something?
I agree largely with Tom's perspective that these are early days, and we have Vice President Harris also now, in charge of managing this. So it will be interesting to watch how she handles this as well. This is an issue that's important to both younger and older Americans. We talked about these generational divides, it could be important to them for very different reasons, as Tom indicated earlier, and a very, very significant challenge, I think, as we head, hopefully, from opening up the economy in the summertime to the fall.
Well, great. I think we're going to leave it there. I want to thank everyone. So this has been Carl Cannon, Tom Bevan, John Della Volpe. You can find out more about Real Clear Opinion research on RealClearPolitics.com. As I think John mentioned, there's a tab at the top. And you can also find Carl's article on this latest poll, as well as the poll itself, all the crosstabs, all the information you want about that poll and our previous polls as well. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us for Real Clear Politics and for Real Clear Opinion Research. I'm Andrew Walworth, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.